morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us at this June's Masterclass. We are so thrilled to have Tony with us today to talk about beating the blockers. I think something that we can all agree we need to talk a lot about. Today's agenda is going to be pretty simple. I'm going to start and just open up with a few notes and thanks. Then we'll get into Tony's presentation. Then we'll go out in breakout rooms and be in discussion for about 30 minutes, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. If anyone has any questions about the structure or about which rooms they're in, there are some language specific rooms that will have leaders in them. If you indicated that you would like to be in a language specific room before the event in the registration form, you will automatically be put in there. If you would like to be in a breakout room that is language specific, but you didn't happen to put that into the registration form, please feel free to just put it in the chat or direct message me. I'm happy to put you wherever you want to be. Before we hop in, I just want to say a huge thank you to our sponsor for today's event, Consensus. Consensus is an intelligent demo automation software that was built to help you scale pre-sales. They're used by leading companies in a variety of industries to bring prospects to live demos better, educated, and ready to talk specifics about your product. Using Consensus, your sales engineering team builds a library of reusable interactive video demos that sales sends out on demand. Consensus automatically personalizes the experience and tracks engagement. This reduces unqualified demos to near zero and can double your pre-sales team's productivity. Their growth and statistics validate this approach. The two most impressive being the almost 3 million stakeholders discovered through the use of automated demos by sales and the average cost of demo when you compare the automated to the price of having your team delivering live demos. If you would like to see an automated demo for yourself, you can check them out at goconsensus.com. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Tony, who's going to give us our presentation for this morning. Tony, over to you. How are you?
Awesome. Thanks, Shauna. I'm doing well. How are you?
Great. I'm doing well. So happy to have you here.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I think this is an important topic, and it's one that I find myself thinking about a lot. So I'm happy to talk through it with everybody. We'll get right into it. So thanks everybody for joining. Since most of you don't know me, I'll give a super quick introduction of who I am, and then we'll get into the meat of it. So I'm a dad first. I live in North Carolina in the eastern part of the US. My son runs into a lot of my calls, so we might be lucky today. We might have a guest speaker. We might not. We'll see. I lead 2 SE specialist teams here at Box. I run the value engineering and platform solutions engineering teams. Basically, what that means is I put my business degree to work and my coding hobby to work together every day, which is pretty cool. I've been at Box for just over 7 years. I've been a leader in our pre-sales org for about 4.5 years. And lastly, I wrote a book that I published in November of 2020. It's all about getting your career off on the right foot. So with that said, let's get into it. So as Shauna mentioned, the next 45 minutes or so, we'll have some presentation and then we'll have some discussion. First, I'll introduce the topic. We'll get into some ways to think about bucketing the stakeholders. Then we'll figure out who actually matters the most in the sales cycle, and then we'll get into some specific tips, and then we'll have a good chunk of time for discussion. So when I really think about the many different sales cycles that I've been in over the years, one thing became really clear to me. Most of the people we're talking to when we're selling can't actually say yes, but they can be blockers and they can say no. So how do you sell against that, right? How do you get them on your side? How do we sell against a no rather than always putting our efforts towards selling for a yes? Most of the technical training that you've had in your career, that you'll have in your career, is going to focus on those topics. You know the ones, topics like discovery, building champions, running successful POCs, all of those important things. We're going to skip all that today, and we're just going to focus on how do we keep people from saying no to us. Again, I said it, it's important. They're important skills. They're critical for your success. They really are. It's just not what we're going to be talking about today. As we start thinking about our stakeholders, we can put them into different buckets. To get started, I really think of this in 3 simple questions and asking myself 3 simple questions. 1, who here can actually say yes? Next, who has influence? Who has influence in the room? Who has influence with the customer? Who has influence over this meeting? And then third, who has authority? Who can actually make decisions about technology, people, projects, priority? So we'll get into each of these buckets with a little bit more detail. So the first bucket to consider is people who actually can say yes. Generally, this is going to be the buyer. They're really critical to win over in their language, and they probably don't have an interest in learning your language. What I mean by that is if they care about increasing revenues by 10% year over year, then your job is to tie back to those goals. If they're in financial services, learn their lingo, highlight things in their lingo, help them follow along rather than making them learn something new. In terms of volume, these people are very, very few and far between. You'll probably have 1 or 2, maybe 3 per deal cycle, but the volume of these people that you interact with is probably going to be pretty low in any given deal cycle. The next bucket to consider is people who have influence. These are the people who are going to be able to steer the opinions of other stakeholders within your deal. It might not be immediately obvious who these people are. It's really critical, though, to watch out for them because they're going to have an outsized impact on your eventual outcome. If you can keep them from being a no, you're more likely to win. And then lastly, the last bucket here are the people with authority. For the most part, these are going to be managers, they might be directors, they might be VPs. It doesn't matter what their title is. They're probably going to have people who work for them. And others might try to make an impression on these people. So when they're in the room, you should be paying attention to who they are because it can impact what other people do sort of to put on a show for those folks. They're also probably coming from a place of status quo is easiest. So they're probably fairly likely to be blockers in your deal if you haven't. And so, as I think about this sort of 3 bucket system isn't really how my brain works. So I came up with a little 2x2 matrix that helps me to bucket things like this. So I would like to introduce the influence and authority matrix. So as a starting point, there's really only 2 things to consider when you're plotting stakeholders: who has influence and who has authority. Once you understand this, you can put people in their appropriate bucket. Knowing the customer's organizational structure might help here, but it's not really critical when you're plotting the stakeholders in this way. Going back to that first question, if someone has the power to say yes, they're going to be in the top right. They're going to have significant influence. They're going to have significant authority because ultimately they have the sign-off power. So if they don't like your demo, if they hate the price point, if they really don't like you as a person for some reason, that could influence the outcome. And so the easiest way to think of it is the further up and to the right they are, the more influence they're going to have on your outcome. I like to do this too, and this might be a little weird, but I like to plot stakeholders for internal meetings as well. I like to think about cross-functional projects and who actually is pushing a project forward, who has influence in any given meeting, who has influence over any given call. And it's just a fun thing that I like to do as well. So there's a lot more that we could unpack here. I've had conversations with people on this topic for an hour, and we've talked about nothing more than just the influence and authority matrix. But I'm going to get into the specific tips. So if you want to get into the weeds on this conversation more, feel free to ping me on the PSC Slack. Feel free to message me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to have this conversation. I'm happy to dig in. So let's talk about tips. How do we actually do this? How do we think about things a little bit differently? So the top 5 tips that I have here are listed at a high level. In the next several slides, we'll get into the meat of each one of them. So the first tip is going to be know your audience. The second tip is going to be say fewer words. Make sure you're using a parking lot. We'll talk about a few ways to build trust, and then we'll focus really on reading the room and not reading a script to a room. So first up, let's talk about knowing your audience. When I think about this, I really think of it as, how deep does my audience want to go? So ultimately, you want to be speaking to your audience at their level. If you're meeting with a developer, they're going to want to talk about things at a much different depth than a buyer or an executive will. To really connect with your audience, you want to focus on 3 things. The first is, what do they know already? And I've been in probably dozens of customer engagements where a customer says, oh, we've made up our mind. We actually don't need the demo. And the AE and the SE make them sit through a demo anyways. And if that's not what they want, you're actually adding risk. You're risking losing that entire audience. We're going to build on this a little bit more in some of the later tips, but if your audience expects to have one experience and you give them something entirely different, you're not going to have a captive audience. So missing the mark here is going to expose you to a ton of risk, and it's really going to impede your deal from moving forward. To align on expectations, the easiest thing that I've found is just use an agenda. Hey, here's what I plan to cover. Does this align to your expectations? Simple question, simple check-in. Sometimes, as we'll get into, their expectations might not align with your agenda, and that's okay. You'll have to adapt, but we'll get into that a little bit later. The second piece is really, how do you close the gaps that they care about? We've all been through those situations. We've all been selling. A cool new feature gets released. You want to show it off to everybody. Your AE wants you to show it off to everybody. But is it actually relevant to this customer? Or is this audience that you have with you really going to care? They might, but they might not. And we'll dig into this again a little bit more later, but just don't fall victim to sticking to repeating the same material for every customer call, every audience, every person, because at the end of the day, the biggest tip that I have for you here is be a human. In almost every circumstance, a customer would rather connect with a person than a demo bot. If you're going to act like a recording, just send them a video. Let them watch it on their own time. You don't have to get 12 people in a room to watch a video together. Again, we'll get into reading the room and reacting to it in a few minutes, but just encourage interruptions. Think about things that make you approachable, and it's really going to go a long way to getting your audience on your side. Next, say fewer words. There's a lot fewer words on this slide than the last one. Another way to think of this tip is yes is a complete sentence. You don't need to get into all the complexities of, well, yes, that's true if, or, well, yeah, and there's this other thing too. Let me open it up and talk to you about this. If your answer can be given in a single word or in 3 words, just stop there. You may have heard this stated before as if you're talking, you're losing, or some other platitude that ultimately means the same thing. Talk less. The more you talk, the more surface area you're adding. And the more surface area you're adding, the more someone can poke holes. And that can have a spiral effect of talking more, exposing more holes, talking more holes, going down a rabbit hole, and really getting into a bad state with a call. And I think the critical thing to remember here is we're selling, we're not teaching. You don't need to show someone how the sausage is made to help them enjoy a tasty sausage. It's already way too many words for this tip, so we're going to move on. Using the parking lot. So I think the parking lot is a really critical part of controlling the flow of a call. You don't need to answer every question just because it's been asked. And I know 2 slides ago, I told you encourage interruptions, help people ask questions, be approachable. That's all true. It's important to let people approach you, but you don't have to drop everything to derail your talk track to answer those questions right away. Especially if you plan to get to something later, tell them that they're leading the witness, and you re-ask the question after I've covered that topic in a few minutes. If you don't feel like your question's been answered, I'll get to it again after we've covered that topic. You can use the parking lot to control for flow, to build trust, and we'll talk about this one in the next tip, but you can also use it to protect yourself against questions designed to throw you off. So, if we really think about it, no matter how important the technology is that we might be selling, there's always going to be somebody at the customer who doesn't want to buy it. And that perspective is really important to consider when you're fielding questions. So, if you look at these questions on the slide here, are you challenging the status quo? Does someone have a vested interest in things staying the same? You might, by selling something, be putting someone's job at risk, right? As an example, if you're selling a cloud-based solution to an on-prem systems architect who's asking a question about one thing or another, they might be asking from a place of concern. They might want you to say something that they can latch onto and derail your entire presentation. If you're selling an easier solution and a system admin is asking you a question, they might be concerned about learning a new technology, or frankly, for their job too. So let them ask the questions, make it engaging, but it's also okay to have the confidence to park the question for later and come back to it, or sometimes forget to come back to it if you really think that it's coming from a place of negativity. Number 4, building trust. There is a lot that you can do with trust. There's a lot of conversations, there's a lot of books, there's a ton of different directions that we could go talking about trust. But when I'm thinking about building trust during a sales cycle, it's treating a customer with respect and not like their checkbook with a face, right? Leave the used car salesman bit at home. Everyone's going to thank you. Even if you're selling used cars, building trust is not a single activity. It's prevalent in every interaction you have during your sales cycle. And if your customer is used to working one way and you're selling them a better way, it's okay to correct them. Your customer is not always right, especially if you're helping them learn something new or consider a different perspective. So I'm going to give a really quick example. I use this all the time. So, when I'm in customer interactions, a customer might have an idea about our API user model or building out a content-driven experience in a portal or something. And they might say something like, oh, this feels familiar, or I think I know where you're going, or this, I know how this is going to end. And the majority of the time, they're at least a third wrong. From a sales ease perspective, I could probably just say something like, yeah, you mostly got it, and move on to the next thing. But from my perspective, this is one of the most critical differentiators for selling my solution. And so I want to help them understand the parts that they do have correct, and then clarify the most important bits of what they've gotten incorrect. And I do that because it's enforcing a differentiator. If I think back to saying fewer words, I don't need to tell them all of the ins and outs of authentication and integrating with their existing user models and blah, 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 all of the details. I really just need to clarify the critical piece to help them understand how we're differentiated and why this is the right solution for their problem. That's it. The next piece here is assumptions. You know what they say about assumptions. I'm not going to say it, but you really do have to call them out. If you call them out every single time, you're going to give the customer an opportunity to correct you. And it's really in our nature as people to correct something that we know is wrong. Every time they correct you, you're getting more information. You're furthering your discovery. You're getting information about the use case or volume of activity, or you might say something so wrong that they'll get up and draw on a whiteboard and show you exactly how it works today. That's okay. That actually helps set you up for understanding what's happening better and will make you a better seller. And as we think about, lastly, for building trust for today, use the parking lot. The worst thing you can do if someone asks you a question is lie to them. If you don't have the answer, tell them that. If you say something like, hey, that's a great question, I don't know the answer to that one, I'll jot it down, I'll get back to you later, or after the call, or tomorrow, or on Thursday, or however you want to phrase it, that's okay. And that's actually going to be your best move here, because that helps to enforce that you are certain about the information you're sharing. It makes you more trustable. It makes people take what you say with more seriousness. And that's just because you said, I don't actually have the answer, when you don't. And so every time you answer, you're building that trust and you're reinforcing that. Occasionally, I've actually faked not knowing the answer to help build this trust. And that comes to reading the room and not reading a script. And I will say that sometimes all the prep you do, all of the hours of demo prep and honing your talk tracks and getting everything just so for a presentation for a customer, it might not be worth it, because you get to that call and the customer had entirely different expectations. Everyone did everything with the best of intent, but wires got crossed somewhere, and that's okay. What are you going to do? Sometimes you're just going to have to fly by the seat of your pants. It's almost never intentional. And really the only thing you can do is adapt. So as you do this, it really gives you a chance to connect to your audience human to human. It's not always as obvious as, hey, here's the agenda. Are you on board? Oh, you're not. Well, let's adjust. What do you want to talk about? What do you want to get into? I'll give a quick example of when this actually worked out really well for me. So I had a 90-minute presentation to a customer. I was supposed to cover about 40 slides. It was hours of work to get all of these slides prepped. I worked through my talk track. I had like 80 of the 90 minutes were designated to me talking to this customer. And I got about 10 minutes into the call. And just a few slides in, I realized that everything was completely missing the mark. The customer had kind of started staring off into space, and they just weren't responding when I was asking questions, and nothing was working. And so I had to adapt, and it really was not going as planned, and the customer was way too polite to stop me. So I had to stop myself. I checked in with them and I asked, is everyone here comfortable with the basics? Great. Let's open up for questions. Let's talk about this. And in doing so, I learned that they had been building on our solution for 6 months. They had all of the basics. They'd made their decision that this was the direction they wanted to go. They just had some fairly advanced questions about, how does this work in practice? So I showed them a quick demo that I pulled up, and we wrapped that call in 30 minutes. As you might imagine, the AE was freaking out. We had so much more time. Are you sure that's what they wanted to do? We prepped all that slide, yada, 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 yada. I knew that was the direction they wanted to go. And the AE thanked me a few days later because they asked him for an order form. And we were just completely misaligned on where they were in the buying cycle. If we had spent 90 minutes with them, we probably would have delayed their purchase and definitely would have lost them in that call. So I threw out a ton of work in prep, got to the outcome a lot faster by reading the room and not reading a script.
I'm just going to go ahead and close us out here by first just offering a humongous thank you to Tony for leading our discussion today. I hope you enjoyed the breakouts, and I hope that there was some good conversation had. Our next PSE webinar is coming up on July 13th with James and myself. We're going to be talking about personal LinkedIn branding. This conversation has come up so many times in both our leadership forum, but also in our regular community of just how people are building brands, and hope you can join us at our next event. And thank you again to Tony. Wishing everyone a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day. Take care, everyone.